Hello, everybody. Good afternoon to those of you who are in Turtle Island in Canada, and good evening to those of you in Ireland. We're just about to start a panel discussion today on a subject which is of really great interest to me. I'm really excited about this. We have some really fantastic speakers, and I am delighted that Ambassador Eamon Mckee is available to moderate this panel. It's a very busy time of the year for the ambassador. Yesterday was St. Patrick's Day, as many of you know, and that's probably the busiest day of the year for an Irish ambassador. So really very grateful that the ambassador is here, and I, without further ado, pass you over to Ambassador Eamon Mckee. Ambassador.
And of course, I've done St. Patrick's Day around the world, you know, Ireland, Washington, New York, Korea, Israel, and yesterday here in Canada. And I had a breakfast in Toronto, I had lunch in Montreal, and I had events in Ottawa, all without leaving my desk. So it was a virtual St. Patrick's Day. But just to say as well that it was a great St. Patrick's Day. You know, it was my first in Canada, but even virtual, I got a great sense of the buzz, the energy, the Irish heritage here. And so, yeah, it was a busy day, but it was a great day. And hopefully we'll be able to do a more traditional St. Patrick's Day next year. Listen, I'm really thrilled that you set this up, James. I think it's great work by ICUF as well. And I love this interchange between Ireland and Indigenous Canada and this whole area of indigeneity. I think it's a very rich one for us to explore our mutual experiences. And they're different, but they're shared in many, many ways. So congratulations to ICUF. And thanks to you. I know Eleanor's in the background in your team. Thanks to all of them. I love the title, Landspeak, as well. I think it really is, it captures something. You know, and as a diplomat, you spend a lot of your time abroad. And the one thing you can miss, like a lot of people miss Tato crisps or crunchy bars or whatever it is, McCambridge's brown bread. But the main thing I miss actually in Ireland is actually the landscape. You know, and when you get off the plane in Ireland, the first thing that strikes you is the quality of the air. And it picks up the heather, the turf, the rocks, the sea salt. You're at home. And it's a very powerful feeling. I think we're very bonded with our land, and I'm sure it's the same for the people of the First Nations as well. Our roots are really, really deep. I've started blogging recently on place names, because we, you know, back when Irish society started, we imparted to place character and descriptions, and it's still in the Irish place names, and I'm sure, and I know that's the same here in Canada. So I'd also like to say that, of course, I'm in Ottawa on the unceded and traditional lands of the Algonquin, and I know that in Canada we should acknowledge that we are on the unceded territorial lands of the First Nations, the Mckee and the Inuit. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think, James, you picked me for this because I don't know much about Gaelic football, hurling, or lacrosse for that matter, so I'm going to be a very neutral moderator. I used to play rugby myself, which was a great game, still love it. But we have a great panel with us today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'll say briefly just a line or two about each of them, and then we'll start the conversation. So Bruce Roundpoint is a very proud Mohawk. He's a lacrosse Hall of Famer and a legend. He's an activist too for the Akwesasne nation and people from Cornwall Island, which is a really interesting place because it's at the intersection of different borders that have been imposed by the nation-state building of the United States, Canada, but also provincially between Ontario and Quebec, and a really interesting history there. So I'm looking forward to the conversation with Bruce, and particularly about what sport and lacrosse means to him. We've also got Mike Mitchell, Grand Chief. Great honor to be here with you, Mike, and I know that you're also a legendary lacrosse player as well as an activist, and I watched your movie, You Are in Indian Land, a breakthrough movie about the rights of the Indigenous peoples, confronting wholly different legal and political systems, and trying to thread your way through that experience, but you've been a tremendous voice for your people as well, for the Haudenosaunee more broadly. And of course, you're on the board of the Iroquois Nationals, and they've been in the headlines, recently, certainly in Ireland, because of the Irish national team stepping aside, and I'm sure we'll cover that. We also have Paul Rouse from Ireland. Paul is, like me, he's a UCD graduate. He's an historian. He's at the School of History in UCD. He's been focused on the history of sport in Ireland. He's written on that. He's written on hurling, the great Irish sport, a very ancient sport, played with continued vigor and passion today. But Paul will speak on sport, both the significance of sport and also, in a way, the limitations on sport. You know, that we have to be careful in the way that we think about sport, about national identity, and to speak about it as part of a bigger mosaic of what it means to be associated as a part of any identity or society. So that's kind of where we're going to start. Bruce, maybe if I could talk to you a bit. We had a conversation about you and how you began lacrosse, and to you, lacrosse at the beginning was not. It wasn't an evocation of identity. It was simply the local sport, and being engaged in sport is really intensely personal. It doesn't have much to do with kind of national narratives. Could you just talk us through about how you came into to start lacrosse? And I'm really interested in how then you transitioned from essentially an amateur youth player into a professional player, because I know you've a great reputation of being pretty immovable, unknockable force on the field in a very honourable way, but a tough opponent. So your first exposure to lacrosse, we'd be really interested to hear some of that.
Well, my first exposure was when I was young, like maybe I first noticed maybe 3 or 4 years old that my father played, my uncles played, and everybody in the community either played or worked at the lacrosse factory where my grandfather, he owned a business making lacrosse sticks. So it was pretty natural to me that I would learn about lacrosse. And what really got me involved is that the games were usually on the weekend, and the Monday morning I'd be walking around outside my parents' house, and my uncles and my father, all their lacrosse equipment would be on the lawn outside the lacrosse factory, and just wondering what the hell all this stuff is. So I picked up the stick, and from there I watched more and more of it, and learned how to pick up a ball, how to shoot with the ball and stuff like that, and it just developed. And basically, no teaching at all. Is just the way everybody picked it up back then. There was hardly any coaching at all. I mean, it's like learning how to walk. Nobody kind of takes you along until you start walking and then start running. You just pick it up and away you go. It was natural back then, and it's not like that anymore. I wish it was more the way it used to be when we started out, but it's kind of gone away from that. But I went from playing in the grass to I think the first organized team I think was back then was the Pee-wees, Bantams, Midgets, and Juniors. And as I played on the junior teams as often as I could get, and then from there juniors. Like I went from junior lacrosse to pro lacrosse, but I had maybe a 3-year gap in between there because I was suspended. I had a lifetime suspension for an altercation with 2 referees. So I was suspended at my final junior year. And with the help of Mike Mitchell and Jim Bishop, they got me a hearing, and I was allowed back in the game. So I went from juniors to lacrosse in 1975. And from there,
can I ask you? Sorry, Bruce. Can I ask you, when you're a young lad, kind of picking up the stick? I mean, there's a very distinctive feel to sports sports equipment and the sense of the stick in your hand and taken to the field with your pals. How important was that to your formation personally as a young man? I mean, was it central, or was it just something that you did at the weekend? You know, when you look back on it now, how valuable, how important was that?
When you first start out, it's basically it's almost like a religion. When you get the urge to play lacrosse, you can't wait for the next game. You can't wait for the next practice. And everybody felt that way. There is such a love for the sport that everybody wants. They can't wait till the next weekend for a game. So in between, if we're not practicing, we have our own little backyard nets in the areas where we play with. In the summertime, like as soon as the snow is gone till after the last game of the year, that's what we did. We played lacrosse, and that's how how everybody learned.
And how in those early days, how important was the community element to lacrosse?
Well, every community pretty well had their own team, starting from the minors up to juniors. Like Cornwall Island had their own team, St. Regis had their own team, and I think Hogansburg at one time had their own team. But and we'd all play in Cornwall and Long Sault, Alexandria, Maxwell. I mean, there were so many teams that we were never short of who to play with. We always had some place to go, maybe once during the week, but on the weekends we were always on the road or at home playing lacrosse.
Yeah. Now you then you spoke very fondly of Jim Bishop, your trainer when you became pro, and there was a real change in your approach to the game at that stage. And I was really interested in the way that you described that, going from learning across, as you say, almost like riding a bicycle or walking, to then the influence of your trainer, Jim Bishop.
Well, he was our coach in the pro leagues, and it wasn't really training; it was discipline. Like he had tough workouts, he had tough drills. I mean, when I first hit the pro ranks, the thing we did in the morning is we had to go on a 1.5 mile run, and we had to keep beating a certain time. And after that, then we went into the arena, and then we had drills and all that. And it was so different because we never had drills or anything. And when we started out in Akwesasne, you just picked up the ball, and then basically you done what you wanted to do, but we never really had a style. Everybody was basically man for man. The guys that were at defense, they knew that they stayed back, but once we got to the pro ranks, and everything changed because we had different plays we had to learn. We had different styles of running, different styles of shooting, where to shoot the ball, where not to shoot the ball, how to use the boards. Everything was so like there was a meaning. There was basically no lost time. Everything you had a meaning.
And was that important to you as well? Did you feel that now I'm kind of I'm at the peak of my game here. This is the way it's meant to be played. Was that kind of sense of professionalism important to you?
It was, until, like, to be honest with you, I quit on gym halfway through the season because I just couldn't take it. Like I said, we were not disciplined when we were playing on the Reds. So once we got to discipline lacrosse, if you're not used to somebody yelling at you constantly trying to get you to improve, then you kind of like beat yourself up and say, what the hell am I doing here? You know, so I got sick of it, and then I just decided this isn't for me. I'll go back, and I went back to work as a 9 worker, and within 2 weeks, I think Mike's brother Ernie called me back, and he says they want you to come back. So I basically knuckled down, and I went back, and I played. I played my heart out. I really wanted to learn the game properly, and I think within 2 weeks I was player of the month. Well, Ernie was, right. I think, player of the month. It was every month, but for an offensive player, I knuckled down and I became player of the month. And but probably the happiest day and the saddest day of my life came at the same time, is when a hero of mine, Gaylord Paulus, he got let go just before we went into the playoffs with Boston. He just got let go by Jim, and he played for Jim during the Oshawa Greengale days, and they pretty well were undefeated under Jim Bishop. They won Minto Cups in a row. And Gaylord back then was probably the best lacrosse player in Canada. He was from Six Nations. And when they let him go, I actually took his spot on his line. And from there, I just tried to, equal what Gaylord did. I wanted to, I really had to fill his shoes, and I think I did.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned as well you played in some strange places, including a maximum security prison.
Yeah, we practiced in the Blue Bonnets horse racing parking lot. We practiced at the foot of the hill of Mount Royal, but after the practice, we had to run up the hill and down the hill, and we practiced on mountainsides. But one day, a bus showed up at the Montreal Forum where we practiced, and we got loaded on there, and we went for an excursion. And so we hit it out of Montreal, north Montreal. And it was like this, we were in a prairie, and all of a sudden you see this giant building in the background, and then as we got closer, you could see the razor wire all the way around the place. What the hell's going on here now? So we got there, and Jim Bishop put on a show inside the prison. It's called Archambault. They shut them down anyways since then, but the bus went inside, and we got unloaded, and it was like a scene from the Gladiators, when all the gladiators were in the cages, and we come out with our lacrosse sticks, wondering what the hell we're going to do now. And all these prisoners looking at us. Most of them had their arms on the bars looking at us and all that. And then one thing I did notice is that most of the inmates were either native or black. There was just so many of them in there, but we put on a good show for them, and they really enjoyed it. And then we got to talk to them maybe 10 or 15 minutes through the bars, of course. But anyways, we got to know them, and they really enjoyed what we had to show them. And the thing was, when the crossbar bar, nobody went after it.
Yeah. Well, you never know what impact that may have made on some of them, but it's an interesting point you touch on, that it was, as you say, it was Black and Native American as a prison population. One thing you did mention as well was that you like your father made the lacrosse sticks and so on. I mean, forgive my ignorance, but presumably there's a type of wood and a craft as well to the production of them.
Oh yeah, it's made out of hickory. The bottom 8 foot of a hickory, that's the only part of a hickory that'll bend. But you have to steam it. You steam it for hours and hours before you can actually put it on the bending, and it's all bent by hand. And then you put like a little bending form, and the guy puts a stick in one, and he walks it around, and then he puts a little wire loop on there. And he puts it in a rack, and the rack is there to dry out the sticks. And then from there it goes to the bandsaw, and then the carvers. And actually, Mike used to work in the lacrosse factory also, and that's where I used to go there before I even got a chance to work there, just to hang out with him and pester him and stuff like that. So that's where we really got to know each other. Yeah,
just a final question on that before we talk to Mike. because they're handmade like that, and because it's a natural material, did you find that you really had a preference for a particular stick, that there was something that just felt natural, or are they all pretty much the same? Because I've never played with a sport, but when you hold any kind of a stick, walking stick, golf club, it's got a weight and a balance to it. It's got a feel to it. Was that a part of the equipment that you felt, or no?
No, when you found a stick, it's basically made for you. You can tell when the stick is made for you. You don't just grab a stick and start playing with. You have to break it in. To break a stick in proper, you're probably going to be playing with it and practicing it for about a week, just trying to get all the kinks out, where to put your shot string, how to loosen up the leather and the nylon, everything like that. How you want your grip. So everything is personalized. Like if I get done with my stick, I'm a right shot, and if Mike's a right shot, he cannot use my stick because it's not built for him. It's built for you. You personalize it, and everybody has a different shooting style. So that stick is to your style, not anybody else's. So the sticks are not interchangeable. They're made for you. You've basically created that stick just for yourself, and you take care of that stick, because when you break it, that stick is no longer any good, because you cannot play with a broken stick. So you always have to have one or two sticks. One, the one you play with all the time, and then you have your spare stick that'll get you through the game. And then once the game is done, then you start on working on the next stick to perfect it. But you always have to have two or three basically in the dugout waiting for their play. So it's very personal. But I find, like, in my career, I've never used a plastic stick. I've always used a wooden stick.
Right. And final question. Have you kept some sticks that have been important to you? The kind of retired veteran sticks that you love?
I had one stick that I won the Masters Championship with, and I had it for years and years, and then I just somebody basically liked it more than I did, and took it. So now, last year, I put up a backboard for my kids to play, and I'm using the stick that was given to me as a senior A coach. All the players signed it, and it was a stick that I really liked. So I'm using that now, just throwing the ball up against the backstop, and it's actually one of the best ways to relax and get rid of stress, is to take the lacrosse stick and the ball and throw it up against the backstop. I mean, that's it's our medicine.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, that's a really important point at the end as well, of how therapeutic is the wrong word, but sport and well-being, just personal well-being, is very intrinsic. I might move to Mike Mitchell. It's a great honor to have you with us, Mike, as Grand Chief, but also as an activist and a filmmaker. And your own background in lacrosse, we'd be interested in your own experience as a player, but also how you see lacrosse as an expression of your community, and of what it means to be, Akwesasne or Mohawk or part of the Haudenosaunee, that cultural resonance. But your own personal, maybe your favorite memories of being a great lacrosse player.
I'll start with what the game of lacrosse means to us.
Right.
There's a spiritual side to the game. From the time that a wooden stick is put in your hand, you could be a baby. And from the first time that you mouth a sound, the Father would lay a small stick in your hand. And that is a spiritual connection to the land and also to the Creator. Much more that on the traditional side, lacrosse is known as the Creator's game. It's also a healing, what they call a medicine game. And so to us, within our own nation, lacrosse has one meaning. In sports, there's another dimension. You know, it's a game, but in our culture, it relates to our everyday existence. It's a time for us to remember our connection to the land. The tree itself, the wood that is alive and continues to be alive, so you honor that stick that you have. And that ties you to your family, to the land, everyday life. You have that stick as if it was part of you. And then back in the day when nations would war with one another, the lacrosse played a very prominent part, because in our culture, in our nation, rather than go to war and kill many others, they always made arrangements that they would resolve their differences through a lacrosse game. And whatever was in dispute here, the decision would go on their side. And then there's medicine. The elders would prepare ceremony that goes with song, medicine, and by the time they got around to it, the part about the lacrosse game was played. That affects the mind and the spirit of a person, especially by elders that conduct the ceremony. So that ties you as a human person to the land, to family, to respect your nation, respect life. You know, songs are sung, ceremonies are done. So within our own world, the game of lacrosse has a totally different meaning. And today, as a board member for the Iroquois Nationals, we express the game of lacrosse as one of the main elements that expresses our sovereignty, our standing in the world, because it ties governance, it ties culture, it ties ceremony, it ties language. And so when we get on the field to play the game of lacrosse, we carry that. We carry that whole identity of who we are. And so when we compete in international lacrosse, everybody waits for the entrance of the Iroquois Nationals, because they know they brought their culture, they brought their history with them, and their whole identity as a nation. So these are all expressions to us that we can express in a good way, because it also represents the governance known as the Great Law of Peace. And it started here way before there was a United States or a Canada. And the whole founding of the Constitution of the Iroquois Nation was founded on the basis of a law called the Great Law of Peace. And that's why they resolved a lot of their differences through peaceful means. And when the Europeans arrived in North America, they made agreements with us. And those agreements are treaty agreements, recognizing each other as nations, equal nations. And we've been fighting to preserve that from the first time that we've met to now. And we express that on the field, we express that in our governance, in our political relationship. We're building ourselves, our children, with the support of our elders. The identity part is very important. The cultural part is important. The spiritual part is important, because it defines us, who we are as a people. So when you look at that, lacrosse is not just a sport for us. It's our way of life. It expresses who we are. And that's what we brought to the world. You know, that's our gift.
Right.
Given the game of lacrosse of the world, we're now being honored for it.
Right. And Mike, I mean, listen, lacrosse has been a very popular sport, adopted very quickly in a lot of countries, and countries that played kind of stick games. Is it a source of pride for you that it is, you know, used in, played in other countries, that it has been widely adopted?
Lacrosse is the fastest growing sport in North America, perhaps in other parts of the world, but definitely in the schools, college, university. It's acknowledged as one of the fastest growing sports of all sports. Right. But what is more indicative is the recognition of the history of the game. We're finally being acknowledged as the originators of the game. There's a history to it, and a lot of the USA Lacrosse, the Canadian Lacrosse Association have all paid tribute and have all made it their business to pass the information of what the origin of the game, what it means, the culture of the game, and if it speaks of sportsmanship, if it speaks of good relations with each other, how you conduct yourself, all those lessons are tied to the game. And finally got around to saying maybe all this information of how you should play the game and its ties to culture, to identity, should go along with it. So yeah, it's a good time for us to be acknowledged.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds like lacrosse is Haudenosaunee or Iroquois diplomacy on a grand scale.
You reach the world stage. We were denied for a long time. When the Europeans settled in North America, they saw through the missionaries how our people played the game. And then the early settlers caught the fancy of the game, and they learned it. They started playing lacrosse on their own, first against us. But you know what happened? They made up these teams, and then they bumped the Oklahomas or the Indigenous people out by finding different rules to say you're not going to play in our organization leagues. And so we kind of had to play on our own, which we didn't mind, because those guys didn't really know how to play the game anyways. Sometimes a waste of time. Later on, when they excelled, they start involving us more in the game. Fast forward to now, the respect is gradually being built in. Acknowledgement is there as the originators of the game. And I might point out the competition, we are acknowledged as in a top 5 lacrosse teams in the world in terms of ability, competitiveness, and spirit. So it ain't that somebody opened the door and felt sorry for us and say, we'll let you play with us. We earn the right to compete at that high level. And so we came to the front door, and we've beaten the United States, we've beaten Canada, and so one of the goals that we have as Indigenous people is the day that we beat the United States and Canada and England and Australia, some of the ones that have been around a long time. We beat most of them anyway already. We want to reach that stage where we can stand on that podium and say, we are the best, we play with the best, and we are acknowledged as being one of the best. But we carry a spirit of the game that we like with the world, and so that's a hidden motive for us.
Sure. Well, listen, I know exactly what you mean, because when Ireland plays England on the rugby pitch, there's always a little bit of edge to it. I mean, we love them dearly and all of that, but there's always that bit of an edge in those games, and we always play at a slightly higher level. So in a way, sport, I mean, I think as you said about the origin of it, sport plays out deeper tensions as well, but in a very managed and controlled way. I thought it was interesting as well that lacrosse comes out of an Iroquois nation that is very settled, that it has these very large villages. I mean, upwards of 400 or 500 people, even more. You know, people of the longhouse, because the longhouse is built for a permanent occupation. Your own culture is a farming culture, food surpluses for trading, and so on. Do you think that's significant that in a way lacrosse speaks so deeply to you, because it's part of that formation of a nation that is settled in the land, even if the colonizers from Europe kind of dismissed it and almost ignored the fact that the territory was taken already? Is that kind of where the connection is made, the formation of the Iroquois nation itself and the Six Nations, and lacrosse is seen to be a part of that social evolution?
I was very careful to be as diplomatic as I can,
Yes.
but I'll state what as plain as possible. Our quest for recognition as a nation, our quest for recognition to the world, in governance, as a people, as a society, we've been downplayed, categorized as savages in early history. We've always been misrepresented in Hollywood. In every way, it's always been an image that is false. To us, the true expression of who we are is exemplified through the game of lacrosse. But we want to present it in we know it. And so the best way that we could represent our people is play as hard as we can, play as a good-spirited but clean, and set a good example, and let people know what our ties is to the game. There's a culture, there's a history, and there's a spiritual aspect of it. And people now are beginning. I've written 2 books on the game of lacrosse where I explain that a lot more. But it's now starting to be more appreciated. That's what I'm trying to say. To who play the game and to the reading public, they get to know more about the history of the game.
Great. Listen, thanks, Mike, for that. We'll certainly be coming back to you. I mean, I'd like to bring in Paul now. Mike touched on their stereotyping as well. And listen, we Irish know all about the stereotyping. It comes kind of part of the package, as it were. The Irish are seen to be emotional and hard to control. I mean, I remember, for example, in the First World War, the Irish were often shot for cowardice in the First World War. And when we looked into it, we discovered that if you were Irish, you were 4 times more likely to be shot for cowardice than if you were Australian, New Zealand, or Canadian. There was this idea of the Irish, you have to take a strong hand to the Irish, And because it was the statistic was so stark, we actually got the British to remove all of the Irish, to purge them from the record of shame, as it were, for cowardice, because this was simply prejudice, and that. So we kind of do understand that. But I'd like just you're an historian of sport in Ireland. Sport is a big part of our society. But going back, how far back can we go to the origin of sport, particularly sport with a stick? Because sometimes I think when does a weapon become a sporting instrument? I mean, and is there, how common is this phase where societies adopt sport in many ways as a kind of controlled mechanism to play out conflicts or tensions in society in a way that ultimately is much more is healthy? I mean, could you speak to that kind of commonality, as it were, of this experience?
It was fascinating listening to Bruce and Mike talk about the history of lacrosse, and it's been fascinating to read about lacrosse in the last couple of weeks in preparation for this session. And what came across both from the 2 men there and from the reading is the extent that the idea of playing with a stick and a ball is an essential form of recreation across humanity. It's part of a shared humanity, and that, of course, stick and ball games developed in different ways in different places. But if you look at what was happening in Ethiopia with the game of Jenna, or you look at the Berbers in North Africa, you go to Britain for hockey and shinty, you go across Asia to see stick and ball games, and of course in Mesoamerica and in Ireland, you have a stick and ball game, which we now know as hurling. And the way Bruce, first of all, was talking about his experience of playing lacrosse, it will have rung so many bells for so many people who grew up in Ireland. That idea of picking up a stick when you were very young, of striking a ball with it, of that growing into being a form of religion for you in terms of how you play. But remembering that it was a game. It was a game that you played for fun, for enjoyment, on the grass, as Bruce put it, and how that game then, through drills, when you go to a higher level, particularly into elite sport, how it grows into a sport. So you play a game that becomes a sport, and then as you pass to the other end of it and you go back to play more recreationally, as Bruce said, hitting a ball or throwing a ball against the backstop, it comes back into being a game for you. And in all of this, the meaning that the stick holds for you, and the idea that the stick, you make the stick for yourself and that it fits you. And that's exactly the way hurlers talk about hurling sticks. And then if you place that in the context of what Mike said about the history of the game and its meaning, the echoes, I think, for in terms of Ireland and to do with the land, is the idea of the game of hurling being rooted in land because of the territorial organization of the game, the fact that you play by rule for the place where you were born and where you live. So you are tied to a place. It gives an identity to the thing, and it roots the game in the idea of land and in territory. And that gives it a meaning which is deeply personal. So you play for fun, but you also play to represent something. And those two things become absolutely intimately bound within each other, within the history of the game. And those things, and they move together across history. And then if you take a step back from that again, and you look at the idea of Irish history, for as long as there is a written record of history in Ireland, there is mention of people playing a stick and ball game. Now, this has been reduced to being the idea of it just being hurling, but there is a record of a stick and ball game. But of course, that record is our known written record, and that reaches back through the stories to a time immemorial. Basically, as Bob Dylan said, time out of mind. It reaches back that far into history, and it's something that has passed through the centuries.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And of course, we should remember that Gaelic Irish society was an oral society, that it was only written down when Christianity came in the 5th century. Prior to that, all of Gaelic societies memorizing laws, history, stories, the literature, the genealogies, passed on in a kind of palace of the mind, You might speak as well, there are two things that strike me about hurling. I mean, obviously it's played with a stick, but if we had a kind of a founding father archetype, it's Cuchulainn, who gets his name from killing the Hound of Cullen, the Hound of the great Smithy, the forger, who is probably a godlike figure. He kills his hound using a ball and stick.
And it tells you both about the idea of the place of hurling as a game within Irish society at the time when those stories were passed down. It was the idea you present Cuchulainn as a heroic hurler in a particular context to demonstrate his valor, to demonstrate his courage, to demonstrate his strength, and to demonstrate his manliness, that this was the theatre in which he could demonstrate all of these. And his stories have passed down. And as if, not to put pressure on modern players, but the clubs are now called, there's clubs like Dunloy Cuchullans and various clubs called Mckee and Fionn McCall, about the heroes of Irish mythology and of Irish folklore. And it's really important. That connection is really important. And that connection was fundamental to the founding of the Gaelic Athletic Association, the organisation which controls modern hurling in 1884. Its establishment was influenced by the stories of Cuchulainn.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Mike talked about this too, and you might draw that parallel with Ireland, that the foundation of the GAA, of sport and prowess in sport, almost as an expression of nationality. This was very much what was on the minds of the people like Michael Cusack, who formed the GAA, wasn't it?
Yes, it was indeed. It was fundamental to it. And Mike used really the language that was used by people who were colonizing within Canada is precisely the language that was being used here about Irish hurling. For example, hurling was described in the middle of the 1880s as being the swiping game of the savage within the Irish newspapers, and this built on centuries of language which fed into these ideas of a very particular picture of Irishness. And it's been fascinating over the last couple of weeks reading these stories, the kind of accounts by French missionaries of the game that they were describing as being played by Indigenous nations, and comparing them to the travelers' stories written of Irish as people came into Ireland and wrote about the game of hurling as seen across the countryside. And the game was presented, oh, this is a wild game. These are wild people. They are phenomenally physically imperious people, although there's a wildness to them, was the presentation of Ireland. And as you see it in the middle of the 19th century, there was a concerted attempt to kind of to suppress this idea or that aspect of a personality, and to present British games and English games as a kind of a civilized form of doing things. Now, what happened with Michael Cusack when he founded the Gaelic Athletic Association, and it must be remembered that Cusack was an Irish speaker who was born in the middle of the famine in County Clare, who was the man who, through the schooling system, adopted English games. He founded a rugby club. He played cricket and argued for the spread of cricket across Ireland. But he was transformed in the early 1880s by language revival, by the land war, which threatened to overthrow, or which did ultimately overthrow, the nature of Irish society. And he read in 1882 Cuchulainn, an epic, which was published by P.W. Joyce. It was his way into the old literature. And having read this popular edition of old literature, he changed his mind about what games people should play. And he set himself the target of making a modern sporting organisation out of hurling. It wasn't that hurling had disappeared after the famine. It's a common misunderstanding of Irish sporting history that hurling was destroyed after the famine, that it simply was abandoned by dint of the scale of the loss of life in the famine, of the emigration that flowed from it, and because of British cultural imperialism. But that's not quite true, because if you look at strips of East Galway and you look at North Tipperary, areas around Cork, and in particular you look at West Donegal and East Antrim, stick and ball games played in the old-fashioned way still survived and thrived indeed in certain communities. And what Cusack did was take those games and put a modern shape on them.
Yeah, I might go back to Bruce, because something that you said to me struck when we spoke before, which is that you've dusted off your stick and you're going to train your young sons, but that you said you didn't direct them towards lacrosse.
No, I find that it's a son and daughter. I have twins, but one's a boy, one's a girl. I find that at an early age, when you basically force the kids into a sport, a lot of them will take it up and pursue it, but most of them will say, I don't want to do this because it's not fun anymore, because I have to do it. So I took the approach that I'll let them decide when they want to pick up the stick and when they really want to learn. Like when they're 5 and 6, it was fine for them to pick up the stick, but just feel it and then put it down. But now, like my son's getting interested in basketball, and now he wants to pursue lacrosse a little bit more. That's why I built the backstop last year. And if he wants to play basketball and lacrosse, which is basically the perfect two sports to play if you're going to play lacrosse, is basketball, I think was derived from the game of lacrosse, because it came from near Ottawa, and we had teams that played up in Ottawa, and at the time when the basketball was basically developed, you have 5 players on the floor, you have a center, 2 forwards, 2 defense. It's the same as lacrosse. Everybody thinks it's the same as hockey, but it isn't. Everybody, and I think I forget the name of the guy that invented basketball, but I truly believe that he watched a few lacrosse games and decided, well, he's going to invent the game of basketball, because they are so. One is with a stick and one is without a stick, And I think if you're going to get kids to play, I mean, the two games, I think that are so similar is I have no problem with them picking up a basketball and a lacrosse, but I want them to truly enjoy it and want to learn it, but not to be forced. That's
forced. Yeah, it's fascinating to make that connection between basketball and lacrosse, because when you say it, it suddenly makes an awful lot of sense. And it's a bit like the evolution from rugby to American football. The only difference is the forward pass, which fundamentally revolutionized the game, but they're very, very similar. I mean, just to go back, Paul, to you, I mean, isn't it the case that when you have the settlers coming in and then the immigrants coming in, the immigrants are bringing their sports, right? And they're bringing it to a different country. They're seeing native First Nation sports. And just as Bruce says, in a way, it's almost like cooking recipes that people are chopping and changing. The Dutch are used to ice skating and so on from their own country, and they bring in ice skating, and then you have hockey and you have ice hockey. Isn't that what's kind of going on in this period where you've got the immigrants mixing, particularly in Canada, and with a very strong First Nations presence? You've got this mix and match 'em going on.
You do, but it's a very particular type of mix and match 'em. It worked in different ways. First of all, there were Irish people who were in Toronto, for example, in the 1860s, were playing hurling and were playing a particular form of football. And they also, Irish people in cities in Canada began to play ice hockey and began to play lacrosse. So the Montreal Shamrocks were a significant team in lacrosse into the 1870s. But what Mike said there is exactly right. The rules that were then established basically changed the nature of lacrosse and made it impossible for Indigenous nations to play. And again, the logic of it seems really, really clear. The rules were dressed up as being around amateurism, but they were really essentially to do with class, to do with ethnicity, and ultimately to do with the fact that they kept losing to Indigenous players in matches during all the games, repeatedly losing. And all this is so clear. And it's sometimes I think we lose sight when we write sports history, we write the history of identity. We forget that the idea of winning and losing is actually makes people change rules. And if you look at a different sport, it was a completely different sport of rowing. What happened in the late 1870s and the 1880s was the establishment of the Amateur Rowing Association, which basically debarred anybody who worked around boats for a living or who was a rower, because these guys would come in and beat the white middle class professionals who control the sport. So therefore, the only way for those guys to win was to keep everybody out of the sport, narrow it down the competition, and to keep it like that. Yeah. So it's a melting pot, but only a melting pot in a very controlled way. However, the one thing we know about cultural exchange is that borders are impermeable. Are entirely permeable during these ways. Yeah, they're entirely permeable, and culture just shifts around the place, and people pick up games like basketball. It's really interesting to hear Bruce talk about basketball. My son is also now into basketball massively. He plays hurling and basketball, and I agree that basketball is an amazing underpinning sport for almost every other sport because of the skills of handling and movement that it teaches you, and of discipline and playing and everything around it. But again, that's a game that was invented in the 1890s as James Naismith, and it spread around the world, born high on kind of American popular culture in the middle part of the 20th century. And it's after soccer, it's the most popular game in the world now. It's just pushing into every corner.
Right. Could I ask all three of you as well, because it's something that we do need to talk about, and that's women in sport. And the formation of lacrosse women's teams and so on. Has that pace quickened? I mean, I think it's universally regarded as a good thing for women and for women's empowerment. And how does that sit within the sports themselves, within lacrosse itself? I mean, in a way, it is a contact sport, but it's not quite, if you know what I mean. Bruce, you mentioned your daughter playing it as well. Paul, the GAA has come on in leaps and bounds in terms of women in sport, and I'm sure that Mike, you've seen that evolution over your own life of women in sport. Would somebody like to comment on that?
Well, I'll say in the first thing, the GAA for very much of its history was appalling in its treatment of women. There are still huge difficulties, but the basic fact of it is that men walked on the moon before women played football in Croke Park. That's just a simple fact. It has got much better as a reflection of wider changes in society, but there is a long way to go for parity of esteem and parity of opportunity.
Yeah. And Mike and Bruce, how would you characterize the evolution and the entry of women into sport for your own communities?
We had a tough time. First, from amongst our own people, there was a strong belief, that women should not play lacrosse. It goes back to that cultural and spiritual connection to the wooden stick. The chiefs and leaders of the Confederacy met several times on that subject. And ultimately they came up with a solution, because nowadays everybody is playing with plastic sticks. And it's not wood. So the cultural side could be eliminated and say just for the sport. The interest was there. A lot of our young women in school, in the community, had a natural ability. They were acknowledged that they're good lacrosse players. But until the time came when they got blessed by the community saying, we found a way how you can play. We don't want you to use a wooden stick. That is too powerful. And the woman and her cycle and the ties to the wooden stick is immense. And so by removing that, they now all use the plastic stick. And there's a big resurgence of interest among our communities. In fact, we have a national team, and they're struggling to become recognized. Like Iroquois Nationals they reached the world stage, and the women's national team are sort of following their footsteps. I think they're going to get there because they have the talent, but they're going through the same obstructions that the men went through. We would like to see them, and we're trying to help them gain a foothold on the international stage, because I think it'd be very entertaining. I think it'd be good for the prestige of our people at the community level, our own people, to see men and women play lacrosse at that level.
All right. It's a work in progress, I think, for all of us, and the sooner we make progress, the better. I suppose my final question before opening up to questions is, I suppose Mike, Bruce, and Paul, do you find the conversation around identity and nationalism, imperialism, do you find those questions are more there's more of an audience for them now? There's more of an appetite to consider these questions. I was very struck by how quickly Black Lives Matter evolved into a global conversation around the origins of imperialism, colonialism, identity, and racism, and so on. And very much the expression of identity through sport has to be seen in those terms, because you've all mentioned, in a way, the colonial experience and how it is intersected with sport as, if not quite resistance, but sport certainly as a way of saying something about what you are. Do you think in the current atmosphere it's become easier to air these questions now? And does that make you more hopeful for where this conversation can go?
Well,
do you want to take a stab at that, Paul, first?
Okay. Well, I'd say first of all, you cannot understand the modern sporting world without putting it in the frame of colonialism and of nationalism. The modern sporting world, as we know it, with its international and national structures, was built at precisely the high point of imperialism and of nationalist resurgence against imperialism and of colonialism. So to attempt to understand modern sport without understanding colonialism and nationalism is impossible. That is not to say that there aren't many other things that shape the playing of sport and the sporting choices that people make when it comes to identity. People make choices based on geography and of fun, of the schools that they go to, of the places where they were born, and of the broader climate in which they are brought up, and so on. But you cannot understand the modern sporting world without discussing colonialism and nationalism.
Right. And Bruce or Mike, did you have a comment on that?
I find in lacrosse, once you put on your equipment and your jersey and you have a team, even though your teammates were on opposite ends of the political scene from you, once you put a stick in your hand, there's no more politics in the game. It's just a game, and I find that's what all the medicine is for. Like we back in the 90s, we had basically a civil war in Akwesasne, and in '92, Mike's brother Ernie had the bright idea of making a Masters Lacrosse League, which is the 35 and over, and they were the ones most involved in the civil war that we almost had, and it lasted almost 2 years. And in '92, there was still so much tension on the reserve. So if Ernie and some friends, they formed the Masters Lacrosse League, and we had 6 teams. I think the first year had 4 teams, and it was like a draft. You go and pick your teams, and then you play. And hundreds of players came out to play the Masters, and it was such a healing experience that after the first year, there was no more talk about the gambling wars that had just finished. It was just the lacrosse wars. Next year we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. Everybody just wanted to get back into shape, and it's hard after 35. It's hard to get back into shape, especially lacrosse, because you're always on your feet, and unlike hockey, you can't coast. You got to run. If you coast in lacrosse, you're on your hate to say it, but you're on your ass.
Yeah.
But anyways, it was a perfect game to heal our community from almost a civil war that we had.
Right.
And after the games, you have a few beers in the dressing room, and everything is everybody's waiting for the next weekend for another round of lacrosse. So I think that's the creator meant for it being a medicinal game.
Yeah. No, I think you really put your finger on it there, Bruce. At the end of the day, it is just a game. But within the context of just a game, it's games are they're fun, they're enlivening. They get us fit, they get us engaged, they give us stories to tell. And it gets us out there. And I always remember when I played rugby, you always have something. There's something intense about the pitch. It's you feel the grass. Is it wet? Is it hard? If you get tackled on frosty ground, it's going to hurt. You're kind of smelling the air. You're looking at the wind, because you need to know the wind if in a game with ball that goes in the air. It really has that intense connection with what's all around you. But you also said, when you put on the jersey, we've often done that in training. Where you could be on one team and you're playing your heart out for the team, and then you get sent on to the other team, and then you start playing out your heart for them. So in a way, games kind of encapsulate the flexibility of identity, that once you're in a group, you're dedicated to it, which is interesting. We've got a couple of questions here, and listen, thanks guys for all of that. A couple of questions here. One, and maybe for you, Paul, the Brehon laws, which were, which were codified before the Normans and so on, do they feature? Does hurling feature, or the games feature in Brehon law?
Yeah, there are laws related to hurling and redress for injury, which tells you something about how the game was played. I actually was very struck by how Bruce was talking about how he played lacrosse, and I was wondering whether he might have enjoyed the physicality of hurling, the way he's spoken about it there. And I think those laws, the Brehon laws, again, they create a very particular picture of society at that time, and hurling fitted in, or stick and ball game fitted into that society.
Right. The other one that struck me, and you mentioned this, Paul, the codification of games within an imperial culture at the end of the 19th century. This is where the Olympics actually begin as well. They're codified at the end of the 19th century. And in a way, both lacrosse and hurling emerge in this period as well. And when you take GAA, for example, and hurling, so many young players, instead of doing traditional Olympic sports, do that instead. And sometimes in a way that's been to the detriment of Irish rugby, where, for example, in New Zealand, rugby was played in New Zealand, formed in many ways by under Irish influence, but they all play the one game, And in a way, it strikes me that lacrosse serves the same function for the Akwesasne and for the Mohawk and Iroquois Haudenosaunee as rugby for the All Blacks. It's almost, you can't separate out sense of identity from sport as well, The other question that has come up, and I mentioned it earlier, the Irish lacrosse team stepped back from the World Games to make space for the Iroquois team to take part. How is this perceived among the Haudenosaunee, and might it open up other connections? Mike, did you want to have to comment on that?
Yes, very much. We owe a great debt to the Irish people. When they pulled back and said the Iroquois should be invited to play the best in the world, and they only invited the top 8 teams. Of course, we were excluded at the beginning, but it was the Irish lacrosse team that said, we want them in. We're willing to step back and allow them to be invited. And it didn't end there. There was a little bit of more politicking and jostling, but we got support from all parts of the world, mostly supporting the Irish people for taking that stand. It created a whole different dimension to respecting your fellow human being. And it was brave. And we're grateful for that kind of support. And there's been back and forth acknowledgement from the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, and Ireland. We've honored them in different ways, and will continue to do more. But the opportunity that they gave us to compete in international competition, we're so grateful for that, and we're going to try to maintain and keep that memory alive of what they've done for us. It gave us the exposure. I also want to just point this thing out. The Iroquois Haudenosaunee enter the international stage and entry when they say only countries that have their own passports, only countries that are sovereign. When the United States and Canada got settled by Europeans, they made treaties. Those treaties were nation to nation. And the British and the French, the Germans, French and others that came to the front and said, we will be equals. We will respect your sovereignty. All those treaties are like that. And we just want a small space of land for our people. We gave them that small space, and they kept taking more. But what's on paper is that recognition of nation status. We're exercising that now, and exercising it through having our own passports, not Canadian or American or English or anything like that. It's been a struggle to get recognition, and that's the way it's been for us. But we're indebted to the Irish people for what they've done. It took a lot of guts to display that kind of feeling before the world, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, and I know that I speak for, well, I can, as ambassador, I can speak for every lacrosse player in Ireland, and to offer their thanks to your nation for giving them the gift of lacrosse as well. And I think we certainly in the embassy and across the diplomatic network were very impressed with the gesture by the Irish national team, particularly because you are the holders, as it were, of the flame, the creators of this fantastic game. So I think that's a very good point to draw our discussion to a close. If anybody had some final comments, I mean, I would say on the passport issue and the nation state, I mean, these are issues that even in Ireland today, you know, we're still unpicking these issues in many ways. You know, I'm old enough now to know that 100 years is not a long time. You know, I've gone past the 60 mark, so I know that you know, I'll be looking to get another decade or two in. But we're only 100 years a nation, you know, in terms of being a nation state. We got our independence in 1922, and we're celebrating that now. And I know Paul has been involved in the commemorations around that as well. But there is still a big dialogue to be had around the nation state, the colonial legacies, how we create space for identity and for sovereignty in a way, you know. And I was reading a great book, a short book by Owen McNeill, who was a nationalist leader, founder of the Gaelic League, a book called Irish, basically about the Irish laws and ancient institutions. And he made that point very acutely, actually, in the 1930s, that the nation state is actually, it's only one option. You know, and very often the nation state, as we understand it, is actually derived from the Roman Empire. It's kind of imported. And the irony of talking about Western civilization is that Western civilization isn't Western at all. It's actually Eastern Mediterranean. It's Greek, actually, you know. So there's a lot of big themes that we could unpick, but we'll have to leave those for another day. And can I just say thanks very much, Bruce, for sharing your life stories and your memories around sport and what it meant for you. I wish you the best of luck in your training endeavors too, as you dust off your equipment with your children. Mike, great to see you. Really enjoyed your movie and your activism and your passion for the diplomacy around your nation. And Paul, thanks so much for taking the time out to join us. I'd love to have you over here as well, so we could carry on this conversation and this theme. And I'd like to reiterate my thanks to ICUF for starting this dialogue on between us and Indigenous Canada. I think it's a really rich platform and a rich theme to discuss. And, you know, I've often thought, at the risk of cultural appropriation, I've often thought it'd be great to bring over an exhibition to Canada called Indigenous Ireland, you know, and to talk about kind of our common origins, because in a way, you know, colonialism was the first experiments, the practice run for colonialism was in Ireland, you know, back in the 16th century. So there's a lot of these things to be untangled at a future date. But for an insight into sport, to lacrosse, to what it means for society, identity, and nationhood, can I just thank you all again so much. Guramila Malgut. It was a great session, and I look forward, hopefully, to visiting you down at Cornwall Island. Fascinating and beautiful place, I know, and hopefully to hosting you up here in Ottawa. So I'll hand back now to James. James, I think you're back with us there.
I am indeed, Ambassador. Thank you very much for a really enlightening and heartening conversation. I'd like to thank all the speakers. Really, much food for thought, and so thank you all. And I think when thinking back to, you know, the team of us that looked at Landspeak, and we've been putting together for months. You know, the core of our mission in setting up this event has been to find common ground between the people of Ireland and the Indigenous peoples of Canada, to find space where we can, common ground that we can talk about, where we can connect and, you know, understand each other a bit more and hopefully build friendship. And I just think that this conversation has, for everyone who's tuned in this evening, and it'll be online, very, very, very heartening in that sense. You know, there's a lot more we can talk about, and ways to build friendship around sport, and through culture and song, as we've seen through other discussions today. So thank you. And I'll just say, tomorrow, we're back again tomorrow. We've got 2 more days of activities. We've got we've got a film program on Saturday, and more discussions about language and culture and storytelling. There's storytelling from both sides of the Atlantic tomorrow. So encourage everybody to come back tomorrow. And I would say that we are very, very pleased to be able to present all of the Landspeak events for free to everyone. And we really want as many people as possible to see. There is options if people would like to help support it. There's options on Hopin, which you find here tomorrow, like on the chat boxes here and there. But we'll leave it there. I'd like to thank you all again, and hopefully see you all tomorrow. Ihuwa.
Slán.